Hello.
Welcome back to
Psychanooga. I'm your co-host, James Grant.
And I'm your other co-host, Bethany Cawthorne.
Welcome back.
Yes, I hope everybody had a great summer and is settling into the new semester quite well. As the new semester starts, many people, we're all thinking about, study tips, studying, how to stay focused and get your work done. For this episode, we talked to Dr. Max Teaford and Dr. Julie Madden. They are both professors in the psychology department. Dr. Madden teaches advanced seminar for psychological processes, which is one of the capstone courses, which I myself am currently taking right now. She also teaches cognitive science, psychology of language.
Positive psych, I think, was one of them.
Yeah, she teaches that sometimes, and then she said occasionally she teaches sensation and perception.
Right, she does. I took cognitive science with her over the summer.
Mm-hmm. And then Dr. Teaford, you have.
Yeah, I also had him over the summer for sensation and perception. He teaches that, although he's not teaching it right now, his main course he teaches is research methods because he is primarily a researching faculty member.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not necessarily as much the lecturer, class teaching role, but he does research mostly.
So with us today, we have Dr. Julie Madden with the psychology department.
We'll start with, I guess, some at-home stuff, right? Outside of the classroom.
Right.
So, like, when you're reviewing some information, some material, and you're trying to kind of make sense of it, right? You're trying to kind of understand, like, well, where does this concept fit into what I know about psychology? Mm-hmm. It's really helpful to try to make connections between the things that you're trying to learn and the things that you already know. Okay. In doing that, it kind of helps you to think more deeply about the concept. You're like, okay, here's this thing, and I kind of think about it in a particular way. In what ways is it like something I already know? Yeah. And so by making these kinds of associations, it kind of encourages you to think more deeply. Mm-hmm. Then as you sort of fill in your knowledge about a particular topic, it gives you a structure with which you can like hang new information. So you can think about it as sort of like building an IKEA bookcase, mm-hmm. right? Like you kind of get your structure from maybe your gen psych class, and you're like, all right, these are the kinds of things that go with like maybe biological psychology or clinical psychology. You can kind of think about them as shelves on your bookcase, mm-hmm. right? And then as you learn new things, you kind of think about like, okay, well, where does that go? What is it like? And kind of you can think about creating sort of structure within your knowledge, right? And so we call that elaborating. So making these connections and trying to think about where it all fits in is really kind of a wonderful thing to do when you're reviewing information. Another thing to do is to generate test questions mm-hmm. and then test yourself, right? We've probably all like used a Quizlet that we found online before, right? And we're like, yay, I feel like I'm doing something. I'm testing myself, right? Like, we'll get to that in a second, but like if you were to actually come up with your own test questions, right? Thinking about like, okay, do I just need to know the definition of this term? Do I need to be able to apply it to a concept? Or do I need to be able to identify it, right? And then sort of thinking about like, all right, what level or how deeply do I need to understand this concept? Mm-hmm. What would questions at those different levels look like? And create them for yourself, right? So you're forcing yourself to think about this concept in a much deeper way than just like, here's all of the stuff that I need to know, like let's stare at it for the next 2 hours, right? Yeah. So it forces you to become more familiar with the information that you're learning, and it helps you to kind of do some elaboration, but also kind of get into a deeper level of knowledge with that concept. After you generate those test questions, self-test yourself, right? Like, all right, throw it into a PowerPoint or whatever, I don't know. I'm old, I'm 40, right? So like I would have put it on a PowerPoint for myself. But I mean, there's so many tools online that you can utilize to create your own quizzes for yourself. Pop it into one of those apps, one of those programs, and just go through the process of testing yourself. What this does is it kind of gives you an indicator of what you know and what you still need to study. And it gives you practice at retrieving that information so that when you go to an exam, you're like, I've been practicing this. And so when I see the test questions, I'm not going to feel as overwhelmed or like riddled with anxiety, right? Yeah. So it's deeper engagement, but also practice pulling that information out. Mm-hmm. The other big thing that I tell students is to space out your study sessions, right? You want to do a little bit every day rather than one massive cram session before you take an exam. This idea is called the spacing effect. Mm-hmm. If you've ever had a teacher assign like a Cengage textbook where you've got like your mastery trainings or anything like that, it is completely based on the idea of spaced practice and repetition. My other thing that I like to tell students is to do this before you sleep, right? So either like study for 30 minutes before you go to bed or study for 30 minutes and then take a nap. Because sleep actually helps with the memory consolidation process and makes your memory more strong. Like it's a little bit more durable, and we have a tendency to kind of encode them and store them a little bit better than if we study and then we go on with a super busy day and we may forget all of that information or other things kind of impede it. The more that we're engaging with it in sort of small chunks, the more that we have opportunities to kind of come at it with a fresh set of eyes, right? Or our brain is refreshed. Maybe our attention is a little bit better. But also, like, maybe you're coming up with connections now that you didn't when you first looked at the material, right? You can think about it like with problem solving. We have sort of this idea of like the incubation effect, right? Where someone's like, oh man, this problem seems really overwhelming. Like you might get that old sort of saying from your family or friends, like just sleep on it, come back to it tomorrow, right? Well, that actually helps us to kind of let go of things that are irrelevant that we're thinking about and really focus on what is relevant. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a similar sort of thing that's going on here, right? Like we kind of let go of irrelevant things, our attention is refreshed, we're sort of coming back to it. Look at your learning objectives.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Like all of your professors are or should be giving you learning objectives. Yeah. What is the thing that you should be able to achieve or do at the end of the chapter or at the end of the course, right? Okay. Particularly if you get them for the chapter, right? Mm-hmm. Like what are you supposed to be able to do, right? Well, if it's identify, some mechanism, well, then like, well, this is the level at which I need to know this currently, right? And then you can kind of focus and not spin your wheels on, like, I need to know every single detail, or thinking that it's not going to be super relevant and you're, like, kind of skimming it over, when in actuality, if you look at what that learning objective is, it's like, no, it's apply it to these different situations, right? So kind of calibrating what you need to know about the information is really helpful, and learning objectives are sort of the main signpost that you have to kind of figure that out.
What would you say are like the worst things to do if you're trying to study?
Well, we have a couple of things that students tend to favor as study methods that really just create what cognitive scientists call illusions of learning. They make you feel like you've done something. They make you feel like you've learned the material. But in actuality, it's not doing a whole lot in terms of like depth of processing or encoding or even practice with retrieval. It's just making us feel good, right? It's kind of like when you get like a vegan cookie, but it's like laced with all kinds of sugar, but you're like, it's vegan, it's better for me, right? Or like the Beyond Meat, right? Like it's kind of that like, yeah, sure, but it's still not the best thing, right? Exactly. And sort of the two main ones that people do, rereading materials without like actively taking notes on the material, right? Just simply saying like, okay, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna reread the section of the textbook, or I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna reread the notes that I took in class, right, that I did maybe on a computer and I just verbatim typed the words that the professor said. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're thinking about anything. How many times have you read a paragraph in a textbook and you're like, what did I just read, right? So what that does is sort of, it's just practice reading, right? And so you become more fluent and like you read more quickly. And because you're more fluent, maybe you're not stumbling on terminology, you feel like, well, I read that better this time, so I must have learned the information, right? And so that's one of our first sort of illusions of learning, and we call that the fluency illusion. Just because it's now easier to read doesn't necessarily mean that you have learned anything from that. The other thing that rereading does is it causes us to be more familiar with like the words. And so that familiarity, you're like, okay, yeah, I remember that when I saw this term, this is the example that's given, right? And when it's in front of your face, you're like, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily even mean that you're going to like remember that information at test, right? So it gives us this like fluency of reading and familiarity with the topic, but familiarity, again, doesn't mean that you've learned anything. The other one that like, this statistic came from like 2016, but highlighting, right? About 82% of college students will highlight in their textbook as they're doing like their first pass reading. And usually what we're doing is highlighting like a key term and like the sentence and kind of maybe some context in which we're encountering that word. But by the time you kind of do this automatically, you're not actually thinking about what it is you're highlighting. Why are you highlighting that sentence, right? You're making no connections, and so you're just doing this automatic process that isn't causing you to think about or engage with the material. And so it's weird. It's kind of giving us that familiarity, right? Like, okay, I know that the highlighted areas are probably important. I'll come back to them later. But it gives us this false sense of like, we have been actively engaging in our studying because we have done an action, therefore we equate it to active studying. But when you think about like, have we actually thought about it? Have we made connections? Have we sort of elaborated and kind of thought about where this fits into a broader context for the course? You're not doing any of that, right? So those are sort of the things to avoid. But unfortunately, they're the things that people love to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are some very good points. And I'm glad you touched on all of those because, I mean, I know personally I can definitely relate with, like, doing a lot of those things.
Yeah. I think we all can.
Oh, yeah. No, who hasn't just, like, reread a sentence and been like, oh, yeah, that's enough.
Yeah, that's perfect.
You remember seeing one keyword, but you don't know what it means.
Right. Like what was the larger context? You might remember like the definition and you're like, yeah, but like why are we talking about this key term? What does it let us know about whatever it is we're learning? Cell phones are a horrible distractor.
Yes.
I highly recommend putting yourself on like do not disturb while you're studying. And probably also not studying on a laptop or computer because the temptation to open up another browser to kind of get into like, oh, I'm just going to check my email real quick. And then you see like, you know, some, I don't know what you guys are into, but I always get like new season stuff dropping at Lush, right? I love like the bubble bath stuff and like that. And I'm like, oh, I want to look at that. It'll take me like 2 seconds. 20 minutes later, I'm like, okay, cool. That was a waste of time. So, you know, I get it that we have like ebooks and things like that, and it does make it very difficult if you don't have a physical book. But as much as possible, try to kind of minimize the other kinds of distractions that are going on and recognize that something that you think might be 2 minutes may turn out to be 20 minutes. I have tried several different methods where you can use like a timer, and like Windows does this now on Outlook where it's like focus time, and you can set it for like 45 minutes of focused work and then you give yourself a 15-minute break. So that kind of allows you to kind of get into what you're doing and get something done. And then 15 minutes to try to kind of let your brain reset, right? Because focused attention is very mentally taxing. And so you don't want to do too much because then it's not going to be fruitful studying or working or doing whatever it is that you're doing, really. Yeah. Let's see.
Right. Well, do you have any final thoughts, advice, suggestions?
I do.
Oh, yeah, you have the
Final tip.
Yeah.
In 2014, there was a paper that came out by Mueller and Oppenheimer, and it was called "The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard." And it's looking at the effectiveness of note-taking, taking notes by hand versus typing them on a keyboard. Yeah. And everyone that I talk to, students and faculty, right? So my friends when I was in grad school, they wanted to use the keyboard because they wanted to get all of the information that the professor was saying, right? But what that does is it's more like transcription, right? You're not actually thinking about what's being said to you. So it's kind of going in your ears and, as they say in the paper, out your fingertips. When you write by hand, it does take more time. So you have to prioritize what is the important piece of information that the professor is saying, right? What is the point of this rambling story that they're talking about? And, what are the details that are necessary? And that's actually kind of causing you to think more deeply about the information, right? It also might make connections for you the way that we sort of started this with elaborating, right? Yeah. How do I link this to what I already know? You can put in your notes, it's like X, Y, and Z, right? And so you have that connection on the page for yourself. And so that came out in 2014, but there was an article that came out in January this year in Frontiers in Psychology that looked at EEG recordings during handwritten note-taking and typing on a keyboard. And what they found was that in the handwriting condition, you're actually recruiting more regions of your brain. You're getting a lot more crosstalk, which enables you to make those connections more on the fly rather than sort of doing this transcription where it was just auditory to motor and there wasn't a lot of other regions of the brain sort of involved. So I think it comes down to, what is the point of being in a college class? What is the point of the learning that you are paying money for and dedicating your time for? Yeah. Is it something that you just need to pass the class and move on? Or is it something that you're genuinely interested in and this information is going to be relevant and necessary later? And I think that if it's the latter, we might want to engage in deeper learning from the get-go. Rather than kind of getting to the end and being like, oh, this is what I want to do, and now I have to kind of relearn a bunch of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I've definitely been there where you get to the end of the class and then you realize that you actually wanted to.
Yeah, and you're like, wow, I should have asked more questions. I should have gone to office hours.
Yeah, I should have done this, that, and
yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But definitely, if you're able to handwrite your notes. Yeah. If you want to take notes in class, and you do it on your laptop, then maybe take some time and make a summary of your notes by hand later on when you kind of go through and re-engage with that.
Now we have Dr. Max Teaford with the psychology department.
So one of the best strategies I have is relating the concepts you're learning about to your own life. So ultimately, a lot of times your goal of studying is to try to form and strengthen memories, and you're more likely to recall information if you start relating it to something you already know. Yeah. So, as James can test this, my sensation perception course, that was a big part of the assignments, was literally, okay, so I learned about this thing, how does this relate to my own life? Again, the goal is, if you do that, it increases the depth of processing, which makes you more likely to recall stuff, and will also make it more pertinent to you. If it's just some abstract thing you're trying to just memorize, you're going to be a lot less likely to be interested and pay attention to it than if you can see, oh, this is how this relates to my own life.
Yeah. So how would you say that, attention plays a role in, our day-to-day functioning?
So attention is really important. our ability to attend to things essentially determines whether or not we end up remembering it or not. So if we don't attend to things, the odds of us retaining things, say from a lecture or from a study session, is pretty low. So some tricks you can do to kind of help you better attend to stuff. So if possible, put your phone away, maybe put in another room, find someplace quiet to study. I know a lot of students love the upper floors of the library for that. Basically, just try to minimize potential things that you know will distract you. If you know, for example, you like to online shop or something like that, maybe just print out your notes or take your notebook somewhere and leave the computer at home. Just basically try to minimize things that can take your attention away from what you need to focus on. And then again, if you include relating it to yourself as part of the study session, that for the most part will help you attend to it more than if it's just some abstract stuff that you have to memorize for an exam.
Yeah, of course.
One of our questions was going to be, what distractions do you think people face the most? But I guess we've just cut it off and say go to somewhere without any external stimuli.
Yeah, I guess what's the most common in college? I know, especially if you live in a dorm, friends and roommates can be a big distraction. If you live off campus, sometimes it can be your neighbors, or if you live next to a fraternity or sorority house, that can be really noisy. I speak from personal experience in grad school in that one. So a lot of times it's other people or electronics, and basically put them away, go someplace quiet. Library is a good place. If the library is busy, maybe find a coffee shop a little bit farther from campus that you like or something like that. Just try and minimize those as much as possible.
Yeah. So, beyond trying to minimize those distractions, if let's say somehow you can't, you can't get away from those distractions, what would you suggest your best strategy would be for trying to help maintain focus?
So there's a couple different ways that I could see approaching that.
Yeah.
It really depends on what specifically is distracting. If it's people, maybe you can just kindly ask them, hey, can you guys keep it down a little bit? Another good thing, if you have noise-canceling headphones, maybe playing white noise through them, so it's kind of something that doesn't want to have any content to it. That can be a good way to block out external stuff. It doesn't necessarily impede your ability to process information, as long as it's not ridiculously loud or something like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of people use that to help them sleep, and that could be another option.
Yeah. So I know a lot of times when people study, I know myself included, listening to music is a big thing that people try to use. But would you say there are types of music that are probably better to listen to than others? For that?
So the one thing I will say is if the music has lyrics, sometimes that can impede your ability to learn new stuff. I usually would try to avoid listening to music while I study, but if I do, I probably aim for something that's either completely instrumental or something in a language I don't actually know. So basically kind of be like background noise.
Yeah.
So one of those two things can be helpful. It won't be necessarily what I'd recommend, but if that's the route you want to go, that would be where I would lean.
Right.
Just because if we don't know what they're saying, then we're not trying to process that information. It's more just kind of noise than.
Yeah. I can see that. I would definitely say that it is, for me anyways, it's easier for me to focus when I'm listening to instrumental music versus lyrics and such. Especially when it's songs that I know.
Having stories that exemplify these things we're talking about makes it easier for students to remember.
Right.
Because in general, we prefer stories rather than just bullet points on a slide. So if I have a story about what happens when this happens, I'm more likely to remember it and probably be interested in it than if the textbook says X, Y, and Z.
Right.
So I guess my best advice, again, when you start finding yourself losing focus, try to remind yourself why this thing matters. And the other thing, if you're studying, spread it out over time instead of trying to just cram things at the last second. And if you start losing focus, take a break.
Yeah.
Walk away, do something else, rest up a little bit, and then go back to it. Because if you're studying smaller little sessions, you're more likely to retain it than if you just keep trying to study and start losing attention. If you're losing that attention, you're probably not going to remember anyhow. So it's more efficient to just go do something else, and come back to it.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything specific, like when you take those like kind of study breaks? Is there anything specific that you would like suggest, like, I don't know, doing? Like, does that make any kind of impact?
I mean, I don't know if data shows an impact. I know from personal experience, I usually do something pretty mindless, like go watch TV,
Yeah.
watch a YouTube channel, whatever it is that you find relaxing.
Yeah.
It's not like
yeah.
super cognitively taxing. Just kind of give yourself a rest.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay.
So just to kind of wrap things up, I thought we could give some of our personal advice with study habits and what we do. A few things that Dr. Madden mentioned were handwriting your notes. And my advice to anyone is get ahead of it before you're cramming for the test the night before. Because I feel like when people ask this, they're asking what they can do in like the midnight before the exam, what they can do to optimize their studying. Like, I try to take advantage of what's happening in the classroom as much as I can, like handwriting my notes, paying attention in class.
Yeah.
And like Dr. Mann talked about, elaborating and trying to tie these things together. Max Teaford talked about that as well.
I definitely I would handwrite my notes. I always find that I feel like I remember things better when I like write them, like physically write them down. So definitely handwriting the notes, and then a lot of times it's just like process of retrieval and like rehearsal.
Mhm.
So just rereading them a lot, or like rereading definitions or whatever, and then the applied concepts and trying to apply the concepts to your own life, or apply ways that you can use the concepts in your own life.
Then one other piece of study advice I have is one thing I learned pretty early on, and Dr. Mann touched on this with learning objectives, is if you look in most textbooks, they start their chapters with learning objectives.
Yeah, that was something that, I don't know, it seems like self-explanatory, look at the learning objectives, but no, that really was a good
Yeah,
point.
when you think through how often you actually think that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because like textbooks get so in the mud and it's hard to read through them. If you can keep that goal in your mind of like, this was said at the beginning of this section or chapter, this is what we're working towards, is understanding this concept, the reading goes a lot better and you understand the material better because you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, and like with the looking for thing, like knowing, kind of having an idea of like what to look for in the textbook. So if you know that, if you know the learning objective is looking for things about attention, then obviously you want to focus on what goes into that point of attention, or what goes into the concept. But yeah.
So we're changing things up this season.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Last season we kind of like did professor-focused episodes where it was like one professor we were focusing on each time.
Yeah, we were focusing more on like what each professor does,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. But yeah, we're changing it up a little bit.
Yeah, this semester we're gonna have like a center question each episode. So like this episode, it was, what study habits do you have? What's the best way to study for something?
Right.
And that's going to be what it is moving forward, at least for the time being.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have any questions that need answering, go ahead and message us on the Instagram. It's UTC_psych_podcast.
Yes. But thank you so much for listening.
I've been your co-host, James Grant.
And I am your other co-host, Bethany Cawthorn. Tune in next time for Psychanooga.